Welcome to Cozy Jury. Tonight's story will test you. It's messy, it's complicated, and by the end, you will decide who's right and who's wrong. But before we begin, if you value what we're building here, hit like. Subscribe if you want more of this, but only if this is your kind of content. I'd rather earn it than beg for it. Drop a comment. Where are you right now and what time is it?
I love knowing who's out there deliberating with us. Now get comfortable. You're not just listening, you're the jury. The fire's burning, the case is open. Let's begin. Harry Foster found the hospital bill in his jacket pocket. Chicago Memorial. 6 months ago, it shouldn't have been there. He'd paid it already, sold everything he had to pay it, but he'd kept the document.
Folded it carefully and tucked it away like evidence. Because that's what it was. Evidence. A record of the night his son chose a cryptocurrency investment over his father's life. The paper was worn at the creases now, soft from being handled too many times in moments of private anger. Moments when Harry sat alone in his small apartment and tried to understand how he'd raised a man capable of that choice. The bill totaled $47,312. He'd memorized every digit. The invoice listed the emergency surgery, the cardiac team, the overnight monitoring, the medications that kept his heart beating when it had decided to quit. Every line item was a reminder that he'd been worth less to his son than a volatile digital asset. The discovery hadn't been dramatic. There was no confrontation that night, no heated argument in a hospital corridor. Harry had simply asked. Called Brandon from the pre-op room, his voice shaking not from fear of the surgery, but from the vulnerability of needing help. His son's response had been clinical, apologetic, in that distant way people are when they're refusing you something. We're pretty leveraged right now, Dad. Tiffany and I just moved a significant amount into crypto. It's a critical moment. We can't pull out now without taking a massive loss. The words had sounded rehearsed, like Brandon had prepared for this conversation, anticipated that his father might have the audacity to need him. Harry had hung up and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the perforations in the acoustic panels, because it was easier than processing what had just happened. The nurse had come in to prep him, noticed his hands trembling, asked if he was scared. He'd lied and said yes. Because fear of death seemed more acceptable than admitting your child had just abandoned you. The contrast between that night and this night was almost theatrical. 6 months ago, Harry had been alone in a sterile room, signing consent forms for surgery he couldn't afford, calculating which possessions he could liquidate fast enough to save his own life. Tonight, he sat in Gibson's Steakhouse, one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants, watching his son and daughter-in-law debate between the 2015 Chateau Margaux and the 2016 Opus One. Both bottles cost more than the monthly rent on Harry's studio apartment in Logan Square. Brandon was gesturing enthusiastically, explaining tannin profiles to Tiffany like they were venture capitalists at a wine auction. The sommelier hovered attentively, nodding with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to young wealth. Harry's own menu sat unopened in front of him. He couldn't focus on food. His mind kept returning to the hospital bill in his jacket, the one he'd brought specifically for this dinner, though Brandon and Tiffany didn't know that yet. Harry's brain was performing gymnastics, trying to reconcile two versions of his son. There was the Brandon who used to help him on construction sites, the kid who'd learned to mix mortar at 12 and could frame a wall by 15. That Brandon had respected the value of $1 because he'd earned dollars with his own sweat. He'd understood that money represented time, effort, the hours of your life you traded for security. Then there was this Brandon, the one selecting a $400 bottle of wine on a Tuesday night, the one who'd started every sentence tonight with phrases like market positioning and brand differentiation. This Brandon talked about money as if it were a game, points to be scored, numbers on a screen rather than the difference between surgery and death. Harry kept trying to locate the moment of transformation, the specific instant when his son had become a stranger. Maybe it had been gradual, imperceptible, like rust spreading across metal. Or maybe it had happened all at once. Some switch flipped when Brandon married Tiffany and moved into their Lincoln Park condo with the lake views and the doorman who wore white gloves. That's why Brandon had insisted on this restaurant, Harry realized. That's why he'd made the reservation for 7:30 on a weeknight. Why he'd told his father to wear a suit. The environment was part of the pitch. Surround Dad with luxury, make him feel like he's part of something bigger, soften him up with expensive cuts of meat and imported wine. Harry had worn his only suit, the charcoal one he'd bought for his wife's funeral 8 years ago. It still fit, though the shoulders felt tighter than he remembered. Or maybe that was just tension. His body had been tense since Brandon called 3 days ago with the dinner invitation, that particular enthusiasm in his voice that Harry had learned to recognize as the prelude to asking for something. "We'd love to take you out."
"Dad, somewhere nice. We've got something exciting to share with you." Harry had known immediately what exciting meant. It meant money. It meant they wanted something from him. And despite knowing this, despite the hospital bill, still unpaid in spirit if not in fact, despite 6 months of minimal contact and superficial text messages, Harry had agreed to come, because he was still their father.
Because some part of him, some pathetic, hopeful part, wondered if maybe this dinner would be different. Maybe they wanted to apologize. Maybe they'd realized what they'd done. The physical space around Harry felt hostile. Everything in Gibson's was designed to intimidate, from the cathedral ceilings to the massive wine displays to the waitstaff who moved with choreographed precision. He didn't belong here. His calloused hands looked wrong, holding the heavy linen napkin. His weathered face felt out of place among the smooth, moisturized complexions of the other diners. He was a working man in a temple built for people who'd never worked with their hands, who thought labor was something you hired, not something you did. Brandon and Tiffany, meanwhile, looked completely at home. They dressed for the occasion like they were attending a gallery opening. Tiffany wore something black and sleek that probably cost more than Harry's monthly grocery budget. Her jewelry caught the light every time she moved, deliberate sparkles of wealth. Brandon had on a tailored suit, navy with subtle pinstripes, the kind of thing you didn't buy off a rack. They looked successful. They looked like people whose crypto investments had paid off. And maybe they had. Maybe refusing to help Harry 6 months ago had been the right financial decision. Maybe their portfolio had doubled while he was selling his truck. What Harry didn't know yet was that this dinner wasn't just about money, it was about validation. Brandon and Tiffany needed Harry's approval almost as much as they needed his investment, though they'd never admit it. They'd spent the past 6 months building this pitch, refining their business plan, preparing for this moment. In their minds, Harry's participation would transform their restaurant concept from a risky venture into a family legacy. They'd even discussed what to call it. Tiffany had suggested the Foster table, imagining Harry's name on the awning, his construction background lending authenticity to their upscale dining concept. They'd convinced themselves that asking for $500,000 was actually doing Harry a favor, giving him the opportunity to be part of something special, to leave a mark beyond the buildings he'd helped construct. What they hadn't considered, what hadn't even occurred to them, was that Harry might say no. In their calculations, in their carefully rehearsed presentation, refusal wasn't a variable they'd planned for. They'd assumed that family meant unconditional support, that fathers always came through for their children, especially when the children were offering something as generous as inclusion in their success. Before this story ends, there will be legal threats. There will be family members forced to choose sides. There will be public confrontations and private betrayals, and there will be a choice that half of you will call justice, and the other half will call revenge. There will be money lost and relationships destroyed and questions about what family actually means when push comes to shove. The police won't be involved, but lawyers will, financial advisors will, mediators will suggest therapy that no one will attend, and at the center of it all will be a simple question that has no simple answer. Was Harry right to do what he did next? Hold that thought. Let's go back to the beginning, to the very first red flag that everyone missed, to the day Harry first met the woman who would eventually convince his son that cryptocurrency was more important than cardiac surgery, to the foundation that was already cracking before anyone noticed the fractures. Harry met Brandon's future wife at a 4th of July barbecue in Millennium Park, 7 years before the hospital incident, back when Harry's wife Margaret was still alive and the world made more sense. The introduction happened near the grills, paper plates bending under the weight of potato salad, and burgers, the smell of charcoal thick in the humid Chicago air. Brandon had been nervous. Harry remembered that clearly. His son kept touching Tiffany's lower back, a protective gesture that seemed more about claiming than comforting. "She's the one, Dad," Brandon had said earlier that morning over the phone. "I really think she's the one." Harry had been replacing a garbage disposal in Wicker Park when he got that call, his hands covered in sink grime, but he'd stopped working to really listen because his son's voice had this quality he'd never heard before: certainty. Brandon had dated plenty of women through his 20s, nice girls mostly, teachers and nurses, and one memorable architect who'd designed tiny houses. But he'd never sounded certain about any of them. Tiffany's first impression was studied perfection. She wore white linen pants that somehow stayed pristine despite the grass stains and spilled drinks that marked everyone else at the barbecue. Her handshake was firm, eye contact direct, smile professionally warm. She worked in marketing, she explained, for a firm that handled luxury brands, cars, watches, hotels, things that cost more than most people made in a month. She spoke about her job with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved it, describing campaigns and demographics and conversion rates with the same passion Harry felt when he talked about load-bearing walls and foundation depth. Margaret had liked her immediately, which should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. Harry's wife was an excellent judge of character, had steered him away from bad business partners and problematic employees for 30 years. But she saw something in Tiffany that she described later as ambition, saying it with admiration, calling it refreshing to meet a young woman who knew what she wanted. Harry had agreed outwardly, nodded along, but felt something else, an unease he couldn't name. The honeymoon phase of Brandon and Tiffany's relationship was textbook perfect, the kind of romance that made their friends jealous and their parents hopeful. They moved in together after 6 months, a tasteful one-bedroom in Lakeview with exposed brick and original hardwood floors. Brandon started dressing better, trading his construction casual aesthetic for business casual, then business formal. He'd left the family contracting business 2 years earlier to pursue commercial real estate, and Tiffany encouraged that transition, helped him network, introduced him to people who knew people. They went to gallery openings and wine tastings and charity galas where tickets cost $500 and the food came on plates the size of saucers. Harry and Margaret attended a few of these events, uncomfortable in their formal wear, making small talk with people who asked what you do with the underlying question of how much you're worth. But Brandon seemed happy. That's what mattered. He'd call his parents every Sunday, tell them about deals he was working on, properties he was viewing, commissions he'd almost closed. The calls always ended the same way. "Love you guys, thanks for everything, talk soon." Their established life together was a performance of upward mobility, Within 2 years, they'd upgraded to a two-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park, the kind of place with a doorman and a fitness center and a rooftop deck with views of the skyline. They hosted dinner parties that Brandon would tell his father about, casual mentions of who attended, dropping names like they were breadcrumbs proving he'd arrived somewhere worth arriving. "Look," Tiffany would say when Harry and Margaret visited, showing them the imported tile in the bathroom, or the Italian espresso machine, or the original artwork they'd purchased from a gallery in River North. "This is an investment," she'd explain. "Real estate, art, experiences. You have to think about appreciation. Everything appreciates or depreciates. You want to surround yourself with things that grow in value." Harry would nod and say it was beautiful, which it was, though he couldn't shake the feeling that beauty and value weren't the same thing. Margaret loved visiting, though. She'd come home talking about how well Brandon was doing, how proud she was, how happy he seemed. But there were moments, small ones, easy to dismiss, like the time Harry offered to fix their leaking shower valve for free, a 10-minute job he could do in his sleep. And Tiffany insisted they hire a plumber because she didn't want to impose, and also maybe it was better to have a licensed professional handle it, since they were renters and needed documentation for the landlord. The plumber charged $400 for the same fix Harry had offered to do while having coffee. Or the time Margaret invited them to Sunday dinner, pot roast and mashed potatoes, the meal she'd made every Sunday for 40 years, and Tiffany asked if the meat was grass-fed and organic because she and Brandon were trying to eat clean. Margaret had laughed it off, said the pot roast was fed whatever cows eat, but Harry saw her face that night doing dishes, saw the small hurt. Or the time Harry mentioned a good deal on a used truck he'd spotted, something reliable Brandon could use for hauling, and Tiffany said they were leasing a BMW because image mattered in commercial real estate, because clients judged you by your car. These moments accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, barely noticeable until you looked back and realized how much had piled up. The first time Harry felt a genuine twinge of concern, the first moment he pushed away instead of rationalizing, happened at their engagement party. Brandon had proposed on a weekend trip to Napa Valley, which was also when Harry learned his son had started drinking expensive wine and could discuss terroir like he'd grown up in a vineyard instead of on construction sites. The engagement party was at a trendy restaurant in West Loop, past appetizers and signature cocktails and a slideshow of photos from the proposal. Everything looked perfect. Brandon's friends were there, successful young professionals who talked about startups and disruption and changing the game. Tiffany's family came from old money, the kind that didn't talk about money, and her father had the particular confidence of someone who'd never worried about making rent. Harry stood in a corner, nursing a beer, watching his son navigate the room like a politician, and overheard a conversation between Tiffany and her mother. "Just until he really gets established," Tiffany was saying. "Then we can think about the next level." Her mother had nodded knowingly. "You're investing in his potential, darling. That's smart." The words stuck with Harry because they framed his son as a project, a work in progress, something that needed development and guidance to reach proper value. And maybe that was normal, maybe that's how all relationships worked. But it felt transactional in a way that made Harry uncomfortable. Around this time, Brandon started mentioning cryptocurrency. Bitcoin was climbing, Ethereum was promising, blockchain technology was revolutionary. He'd send Harry articles about digital assets and decentralized finance, trying to explain concepts that seemed deliberately complicated, designed to make you feel stupid for not understanding. Harry would read the articles or try to, but they felt like science fiction, money that existed only on computers, value determined by collective belief rather than gold or government backing. Brandon was investing, he said, not a lot at first, just playing around, learning the space. Tiffany was skeptical initially, thought it was risky, but then her marketing firm landed a cryptocurrency client and suddenly she was all in. They started talking about it constantly. The future of finance, getting in early, life-changing wealth. Harry and Margaret would sit at dinner listening to their son explain why traditional banking was obsolete, why fiat currency was doomed, why they were positioned to ride the wave of inevitable technological disruption. Margaret asked questions, tried to understand. Harry stayed quiet, nodded along, but thought about the 30 years he'd spent building things people could see and touch. Foundations, walls, roofs. Things that existed in physical space, that provided shelter, that wouldn't disappear if the internet went down. What Harry believed about their relationship, what he told himself during quiet moments of doubt, was that Tiffany made Brandon happy, and that was enough. He believed his son had found someone who challenged him, pushed him to be more successful, helped him achieve things Harry himself had never achieved. He believed that maybe this was how modern relationships worked, more partnership than romance. Two ambitious people building a life together like a business venture. He believed that his own marriage, built on simpler foundations of love and loyalty and shared struggle, was from a different era and maybe not the model for how things worked now. He believed that the distance growing between him and Brandon was natural, inevitable, the consequence of his son becoming his own man. He believed that family meant supporting the choices your children made, even when you didn't fully understand those choices. He believed that the occasional phone calls and holiday visits were enough, that proximity wasn't the same as closeness. He believed, or tried to believe, that everything was fine, normal. The natural evolution of a parent-child relationship as the child became an adult. And most of all, he believed that when it mattered, when something truly important happened, his son would be there. Because that's what family did. You showed up. You helped. You didn't let the people you loved face crisis alone. Everything seemed fine, normal. The kind of normal that doesn't feel normal until you look back and realize how many warning signs you ignored. Until something happens that makes you question every assumption you built your world on. Until a phone call from a hospital room forces you to confront the distance between what you believed and what was actually true. Until you realize that the son you raised and the man he became are two different people, and you're not sure when the transformation happened or if you could have stopped it. Until you understand that fine and normal are just stories we tell ourselves to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. Until the moment arrives when you need help and discover exactly what you're worth to the people you'd sacrifice anything for. Until a cardiac event reveals who your family really is, when the stakes are life and death and $500,000 in crypto seems more important than $47,000 for emergency surgery. Until the moment that changes everything, the moment that started with chest pain and ended with the death of a relationship, the moment Harry kept replaying, kept trying to rewrite, kept wishing had gone differently. The moment that began on an ordinary Tuesday in March when Harry Foster's heart decided to quit, and his son decided that saving his investment portfolio mattered more than saving his father's life. The inciting incident happened on a Tuesday because heart attacks don't care about convenience. Harry had been working on a bathroom renovation in Bucktown, replacing the shower surround in a vintage greystone that had probably been beautiful in 1920 but now mostly just had plumbing issues. The homeowner was a lawyer who worked from home, and they'd been making small talk while Harry worked, discussing the upcoming Cubs season and whether the new mayor would actually fix the potholes on Darman Avenue. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. Harry remembered the exact time because he'd just checked his watch, calculating how many hours he had left before he needed to stop for the day. The chest pain started as pressure, like someone had placed a weight on his sternum and kept adding pounds. Not sharp, not stabbing, just heavy, persistent, growing. Harry's first thought was heartburn from the Italian beef sandwich he'd eaten for lunch. Too much giardiniera, probably. His stomach wasn't what it used to be. But the pressure spread. Across his chest, into his left arm, up his neck. His jaw ached. His breathing felt shallow, like he was pulling air through a straw. Sweat broke out across his forehead, cold and sudden, the kind of sweat that doesn't come from heat or exertion, but from something wrong inside. The bathroom started to tilt. Not spinning, just tilting, like the floor had become a ramp. Harry set down his tile cutter carefully, muscle memory overriding panic, because you don't drop tools even when you're dying. The lawyer was still talking, something about the Cubs' pitching rotation, not noticing that Harry had stopped responding. Harry tried to say something, opened his mouth, but his voice came out thin and strange. "I need to sit down," he managed. The lawyer turned around, saw Harry's face, went white. Oh God, are you okay? Should I call someone?" Harry nodded, wanted to say, "Call 911, but the pressure in his chest had become pain now, real pain, radiating pain, and speaking required more air than he could pull. The lawyer was already dialing, phone to his ear, giving the address to the dispatcher, saying something about chest pain and grey complexion, and yes, he's conscious, but barely. The paramedics arrived in what felt like seconds and hours simultaneously. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing unpredictably. They asked Harry questions. "Have you had chest pain before? Are you taking any medications? Do you have a history of heart problems?" Harry answered in fragments. "No. Blood pressure pills. My dad died of a heart attack at 63. They loaded him onto a gurney, strapped him down, started an IV, attached monitors that beeped with urgent consistency." The lawyer stood in his bathroom doorway looking terrified and guilty, like Harry's heart attack was somehow his fault for hiring him. "Don't worry about the tile," Harry said, because even in crisis he was thinking about the job, about leaving work unfinished, about professional reputation. The paramedic closest to Harry's head, a young woman with kind eyes, told him to stop talking, to save his energy, to focus on breathing. They wheeled him out through the narrow hallway, careful not to bang his gurney against the vintage woodwork, and loaded him into the ambulance where the beeping got louder and more insistent. Chicago Memorial was 15 minutes away, but the ambulance made it in 8, siren-clearing traffic, running lights that would have been red under normal circumstances. Harry watched the ceiling of the ambulance, white panels and medical equipment, and the paramedic's face, hovering over him asking questions he couldn't focus on answering. "Sir, can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, sir? Are you allergic to any medications? Sir, we're going to give you aspirin. I need you to chew it." The aspirin tasted chalky and terrible. The pain in Harry's chest was definitely a 9, maybe a 10, but he said 7 because he didn't want to seem dramatic. The paramedic's expression suggested she knew he was lying. They radioed ahead to the hospital, medical terminology Harry didn't understand, phrases like ST elevation and cardiac catheterization, and activate the cath lab. The words sounded serious, final, like they were describing something that happened to other people, older people, people who didn't take care of themselves. Harry had always taken care of himself, ate reasonably well, didn't smoke, drank maybe 2 beers a week, stayed active, did everything right, and his heart was still trying to kill him. The ER was chaos controlled by routine. Nurses descended immediately, transferring Harry from the paramedic's gurney to a hospital bed, cutting off his shirt with scissors that seemed unnecessarily efficient. Electrodes attached to his chest, blood pressure cuffs squeezing his arm. More IVs. A doctor appeared, young guy who looked like he should still be in medical school, introducing himself as Dr. Patel from cardiology. "You're having a heart attack, Mr. Foster. We need to do an emergency catheterization to open the blocked artery. It's a relatively straightforward procedure, but it needs to happen now. Do you understand?" Harry nodded. "Do you have family we should call?" Harry gave them Brandon's number, his son's name, said he's my emergency contact, said please tell him what's happening. The nurse dialed while Dr. Patel explained the procedure, talking about threading a catheter through the femoral artery and inserting a stent and restoring blood flow. Harry heard maybe half of it. His brain was trying to process having a heart attack while simultaneously wondering if Brandon was in a meeting, if he'd answer, if he'd come. The nurse was talking now, explaining the situation to whoever answered Brandon's phone. Harry could only hear one side of the conversation, but he could tell it wasn't going well. The nurse's face shifted from professional to confused to uncomfortable. She handed Harry the phone. "It's your son." Brandon's voice came through the phone with that particular tone of someone pulled from something important. "Dad, what's going on? They said something about your heart." Harry tried to explain, to stay calm, to not sound scared even though he was terrified. "I'm at Chicago Memorial. They're saying I need emergency surgery, a catheterization. Something's blocked and they need to fix it now." There was a pause, a long one. Harry could hear office sounds in the background, phones ringing, people talking, the ambient noise of a busy workplace. "Jesus, Dad, Are you okay?"
Are they taking care of you? Harry said yes, they were taking care of him, but he needed Brandon to know about the surgery, needed him here, needed to not be alone. Another pause. Okay, I'm downtown right now. I can probably get there in an hour, maybe 90 minutes, depending on traffic. They're prepping you for surgery now. Harry said yes, said it was happening soon.
Said that wasn't the only thing. He needed to talk about money. The words came out harder than the chest pain admission. The surgery was going to be expensive. He had insurance, but there would be gaps, co-pays, deductibles. He didn't have $40,000 sitting around. He needed help. He needed Brandon to help him. The silence that followed was different, colder. When Brandon spoke again, his voice had changed. It had that careful quality of someone delivering bad news they'd rehearsed. "Dad, this is really terrible timing. Tiffany and we just moved a huge amount into crypto, like our entire savings. The market's at a critical point, and if we pull out now, we'd take a massive loss. We're talking potentially hundreds of thousands down the drain. I want to help, I do. But we literally don't have liquid cash right now. Everything's tied up. Can't you use a credit card? Or talk to the hospital about a payment plan?" Harry felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with cardiac arrest. The beeping on the monitor got faster. A nurse glanced over, concerned. Harry tried to keep his voice steady. "Brandon, they want to do the surgery within the hour. I don't have time to arrange payment plans. I need $47,000 or they're going to..." He didn't finish the sentence. Couldn't finish it. The implication hung there. His son's response was quick, defensive. "They can't refuse to treat you, Dad. That's illegal. They have to stabilize you regardless of ability to pay. You'll be fine. We can figure out the billing stuff later. Just focus on getting better, okay? I'll try to get there as soon as I can, but traffic's brutal right now and I've got this client meeting at 4 that I really can't miss. But I'll come tonight, I promise. Love you, Dad. Gotta run." The line went dead. Harry held the phone against his ear for several seconds after Brandon hung up, listening to silence, trying to process what had just happened. His son had chosen cryptocurrency over cardiac surgery, had calculated the risk-to-reward ratio and determined that his father's life was worth less than potential market losses, had promised to visit after a client meeting, like Harry was having his tonsils out instead of emergency heart surgery. The nurse gently took the phone from Harry's hand, her expression carefully neutral in that way, medical professionals, master, giving nothing away. Dr. Patel was back, asking if they'd reached his family, if someone was coming. Harry nodded automatically, lying, saying, "Yes, my son is on his way," because admitting the truth felt impossible. The doctor explained they needed to discuss the surgery in detail, needed Harry to sign consent forms, needed to talk about risks and benefits and what happens next. But first they needed to talk about payment. Insurance would cover some of it, not all. There'd be a significant out-of-pocket cost. Did Harry have the means to cover that? Could he provide a credit card or arrange a payment guarantee? Harry's mind went immediately to his possessions. What did he own that could be liquidated quickly? The apartment was rented. He had maybe 12,000 in savings, a retirement account he could raid, but that would take days to access. Tools, but used tools, didn't fetch much. And then he thought of the truck, his 1967 Chevrolet C10 mint condition, the vehicle he'd restored over 2 years in his garage, the truck that had been Margaret's last birthday present to him before she died. She'd found it in a barn in Wisconsin, rusted and forgotten, paid $1,000 and told Harry to make it beautiful. He'd rebuilt that truck from the frame up. New engine, new transmission, period-correct paint job in two-tone blue and white, chrome that he'd polished by hand. Interior he'd reupholstered using original patterns. The truck was worth $60,000, maybe more to the right buyer. It was also the only thing Harry owned that he loved, the only tangible connection to Margaret he had left besides photographs and memories. And it could be sold today if he found the right buyer, if he accepted less than market value, if he was desperate enough. Harry was desperate enough. He asked the nurse for his phone back, hands trembling as he searched for the number of a guy he knew who dealt in classic cars. Tommy Breslin ran a shop in Cicero, always told Harry, "If you ever want to sell that truck, call me first." Harry called. Tommy answered on the second ring. Harry explained the situation in clipped sentences. "Heart attack. Need cash. Today. How much can you give me?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I can do 35,000 cash, picked up today." "But Harry, you sure about this? That truck's worth way more if you wait for the right buyer." Harry wasn't sure. Wasn't sure about anything except that he needed surgery, and his son had refused to help, and the truck was all he had. 35,000 would cover most of it. The hospital could bill him for the rest. He could make payments. He'd figure it out. "Yes," Harry said, "I'm sure. Come get it." Tommy said he'd be at Harry's apartment in 2 hours. Where should he leave the cash? Harry gave him Brandon's address, said leave it with the doorman, said tell him it's for his father, said maybe seeing that cash, knowing what it cost, would make Brandon understand what he'd done. Tommy promised he would, said he was sorry. Said the truck would go to a good home, said that didn't make this any less shitty. Harry signed the consent forms. They wheeled him toward the catheterization lab, fluorescent lights passing overhead like runway markers, each one taking him closer to surgery. He was about to pay for with the last thing that mattered to him. The anesthesiologist explained they'd use conscious sedation. He'd be awake, but relaxed, might not remember much afterward. That sounded perfect. Harry wanted to forget this entire day. Wanted to forget the phone call with his son. Wanted to forget the calculation he'd been forced to make, trading memory for survival, love for life. The sedation kicked in and the world went soft and distant, the pain receding to something manageable, something he could observe without feeling. Dr. Patel's voice came from somewhere above, saying, "We're starting now. You're going to feel some pressure. Just breathe normally." Harry breathed. Felt the catheter threading through his artery. Felt nothing and everything. Felt alone in a way he'd never experienced, surrounded by medical professionals who cared in their professional capacity, but didn't love him, didn't know him, couldn't fill the absence of family. The surgery took 90 minutes. Harry woke up in recovery with a nurse checking his vitals. Explaining the procedure had gone well, the blockage was cleared, the stent was placed. He'd need to stay overnight for monitoring. Did he need anything?
Water? Ice chips? Someone to call? Harry asked if his son had arrived. The nurse checked her notes, shook her head. Not yet, but visiting hours ran until 9. Still plenty of time. Harry nodded, knowing Brandon wouldn't come. Knowing that client meeting had run late, or traffic was bad, or something had come up that justified his absence.
Knowing that his son had made his choice, and no amount of waiting would change it. Around 8 o'clock, Harry's phone buzzed with a text message. Brandon, sorry Dad meeting ran way late and now we're stuck in the west suburbs at a property showing. Won't make it tonight. But talk to your doctor, he said surgery went great, you're in good hands. Rest up and I'll see you soon. Love you. The seeing you soon never happened. Brandon didn't visit the next day either, or the day Harry was discharged, taking an Uber back to his apartment because he had no one to pick him up, or the week after when Harry was supposed to rest, but instead had to arrange selling his furniture and tools to pay the remaining hospital bill. Brandon did call once, 3 days post-surgery, asking how Harry was feeling and mentioning that Tommy had dropped off cash at their condo. Weird move, Dad. You could have just had him deposit it or something. Why'd you send it to our place? Harry had explained, voice flat with exhaustion, that he'd sold the truck to pay for the surgery since his son couldn't help. Brandon had gotten defensive. I told you we were leveraged and you're fine, right? The surgery worked, so it all turned out okay. You're making this sound like some big dramatic thing, when really you just had to liquidate an asset. That's not the end of the world. People sell stuff all the time. Harry had hung up without saying goodbye. The first time he'd ever done that to his son. The emotional toll was physical. Harry stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. His appetite disappeared. Food tasted like cardboard. He lost 15 pounds in a month. Weight his lean frame couldn't afford to lose. Work became mechanical, going through motions without engagement, arriving at job sites and forgetting why he'd come. Other contractors noticed, asked if he was okay, if the heart attack had left lasting effects. Harry said he was fine, healing up, just needed time. But the truth was he was stuck in a loop of betrayal, replaying that phone call from the hospital, hearing Brandon's voice explain that cryptocurrency was more important than his father's life. The rational part of Harry's brain understood the financial pressure, understood that pulling money from investments could mean real losses, understood that 38-year-old adults had their own priorities and obligations. But the father part, the part that had raised Brandon alone after Margaret died, the part that had paid for college and helped with the down payment on Brandon's first car, and been there for every milestone, that part couldn't reconcile being abandoned when it mattered most. Friends told Harry to forgive. Family was complicated. Brandon had made a mistake. He was young. He'd come around. But Harry wasn't sure he wanted forgiveness. Forgiveness felt like accepting that what happened was okay, forgivable, something you move past and don't mention at Thanksgiving. And it wasn't okay. It would never be okay. Your child is supposed to be the person who shows up, the person who drops everything, the person who chooses you over money every single time because that's what love means. Brandon had failed that test, had revealed himself to be someone who valued his portfolio over his parent. And once you see that, once you know that about someone, how do you unsee it? How do you go back to the relationship you had before? How do you trust them again? Harry didn't have answers, just questions that kept him awake at night, staring at his ceiling, wondering where he'd gone wrong in raising his son, what he'd missed, what he could have done differently to prevent this outcome. 6 months passed. Harry healed physically. The stent worked. The medications managed his blood pressure. His cardiologist said he was doing great, all things considered, clear to return to full work duties. But the other damage, the invisible damage, hadn't healed at all. It had calcified, hardened into something permanent. Harry had begun arranging his life around Brandon's absence, stopped expecting phone calls, stopped hoping for visits, accepted that he had a son in biological fact only. Then Brandon called with the dinner invitation, Gibson's Steakhouse. 7:30, wear a suit, we've got something exciting to share. And despite everything, despite the hospital and the truck and the 6 months of minimal contact, Harry agreed to come, because some small, stupid, hopeful part of him wondered if maybe this was the apology. Maybe Brandon had realized what he'd done. Maybe he'd spent 6 months feeling guilty, working up courage, and this dinner was the olive branch. Maybe it was an attempt to make things right. That hope died the moment Harry saw Brandon and Tiffany at the table, scrolling through a leather-bound presentation folder, practicing their pitch like they were meeting with investors instead of family. The folder had architectural renderings, financial projections, market analysis, a full business plan for a high-end fusion restaurant they wanted to open in River North. They needed $500,000. They wanted Harry to provide it, not as a loan, as an investment, a chance to be part of something special, an opportunity he should feel grateful for. And sitting there in his funeral suit, watching his son explain projected profit margins and return on investment, Harry understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't an apology, it was an ask, another calculation, another moment where Brandon looked at his father and saw a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be loved. And Harry felt the hospital bill in his pocket, folded and waiting, the evidence that would turn this dinner into a trial, the proof that would force his son to confront what he'd done or reveal himself completely. And either way, nothing would ever be the same. The tension had been building before they'd even ordered food, electric and inevitable, the kind of pressure that precedes storms. Harry could feel it in his chest, not the cardiac kind, but something equally visceral, the physical manifestation of rage he'd been suppressing for 6 months. Brandon and Tiffany hadn't noticed. They were too focused on their presentation, on the carefully rehearsed pitch they'd probably practiced a dozen times in their condo, timing their enthusiasm, calibrating their ask. The wine had arrived, the expensive Bordeaux Brandon had selected, poured into glasses that caught the light like liquid rubies. Tiffany had done the toast, to family, to new ventures, to building something meaningful together. The irony was so thick Harry nearly choked on it. He'd raised his glass reflexively, the social conditioning of 70 years overriding his disgust, but he hadn't drunk. Just set the glass down and watched his son and daughter-in-law sip their $400 wine, watched them savor it with the appreciation of people who thought expensive meant valuable. Brandon had launched into the pitch over appetizers neither Harry nor Brandon's father had touched. The restaurant concept was ambitious, he'd explained. Upscale fusion cuisine combining traditional Chicago steakhouse elements with Japanese techniques and presentation. Think Wagyu beef with miso glaze. Think sushi-grade tuna prepared like an Italian crudo. The kind of food that photographs beautifully, that influencers would post about, that would generate organic social media buzz. They'd identified a location, a former gallery space in River North with 20-foot ceilings and original exposed brick. The landlord was offering favorable terms to the right tenant, someone who'd elevate the neighborhood's dining scene. They'd found a chef, a young guy who'd worked at Alinea and Girl, and the goat, who was ready to leave fine dining and build his own concept. They had a complete business plan, market research, competitive analysis, financial projections showing profitability within 18 months. Everything was in place. They just needed capital. $500,000 for build-out, equipment, initial inventory, and operating expenses until they reached cash flow positive. Tiffany had taken over the presentation seamlessly, the two of them working in practice tandem like a corporate pitch team. She'd pulled out renderings, glossy prints showing the proposed interior design. Raw wood tables, Edison bulb lighting, an open kitchen where diners could watch their meals being prepared, a cocktail program featuring house-made infusions and Japanese whiskies, a private dining room for groups, which they'd offer for corporate events and intimate celebrations. The renderings were beautiful, Harry had to admit. Professionally done, the kind of thing that made you want to be there, to experience the space. Tiffany walked him through the revenue model, explaining average check sizes and table turnover rates, and the profit margins on alcohol. She'd done her homework. Every question Harry might ask had a prepared answer. Every concern had a planned response. This wasn't a casual family conversation. This was a formal pitch. They'd brought materials, they'd rehearsed, they expected him to write a check. What struck Harry most wasn't the audacity of asking for $500,000. It was the confidence, the absolute certainty that he'd say yes. That family meant unlimited financial support. That being someone's father meant being their bank account, available for withdrawal whenever opportunity knocked. Brandon kept using phrases like generational wealth and legacy investment, positioning the restaurant as something Harry should want to be part of, something that would bear the Foster name and outlive them all. Tiffany emphasized the family angle too, talking about how Harry's construction expertise would be invaluable during build-out, how he could be involved in the design process, how this was a chance for them all to build something together. The subtext was clear. They weren't just asking for money, they were offering him relevance, purpose, a role in their successful lives, and they genuinely believed he should be grateful for the opportunity. Harry had let them talk, nodded at appropriate moments, asked a few basic questions about timeline and licensing and competition, played the role of interested potential investor. But inside he was calculating something different. He was measuring the gap between what they were asking for and what they'd given. $500,000 for a restaurant versus $0 for emergency surgery, projected returns on investment versus actual saved life, legacy building versus fundamental betrayal. The math didn't work, not emotionally, not morally, not in any framework that made sense outside of pure sociopathic capitalism. And watching them pitch, watching their animated faces and gesturing hands, Harry realized something devastating. They didn't remember, or they did remember, but had rationalized it so completely that it no longer registered as wrong. In their narrative, they'd made a sound financial decision 6 months ago, held their position during market volatility, protected their assets, and it had worked out. The crypto had appreciated. Harry had survived. Everyone had won. There were no victims, just different investment strategies. The recognition of Harry's values clashing with their worldview hit him like a second heart attack. He'd raised Brandon to believe that people mattered more than profit. That family was sacred, that you measured wealth in relationships and integrity, not dollars and deals. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had been unlearned, replaced by Tiffany's marketing speak and the seductive logic of compound returns. His son had become someone who could look at a father and see a potential investor, someone who could ask for $500,000 without acknowledging the $47,000 he'd refused, someone who thought legacy meant a restaurant with his name on it rather than the life he'd implicitly valued at less than a cryptocurrency position. And the worst part, the part that made Harry want to flip the table and walk out, was that Brandon seemed genuinely confused by any hesitation. Why wouldn't you invest? This is a great opportunity. We're family. This is what family does. Support each other's dreams. But what about my dreams? Harry wanted to ask. What about my dream of not dying alone in a hospital? What about my dream of keeping the truck my dead wife gave me? What about my dream of having a son who gave a shit whether I lived or died? Those dreams hadn't mattered. Those dreams had been weighed against market timing, and found wanting. And now they expected him to fund their dream, to subsidize their ambition, to pretend the last 6 months hadn't happened, to act like family while being treated like a transaction. The hypocrisy was stunning. The entitlement was breathtaking. And Harry decided in that moment that he wasn't going to let it slide, wasn't going to smile and make excuses and let them believe this was normal. He was going to make them see. Force them to confront what they'd done. And if they still didn't understand, if they still couldn't grasp the fundamental betrayal, then at least he'd know. At least he'd have tried. At least he wouldn't spend the rest of his life wondering if he'd been too harsh, too judgmental, too unwilling to forgive. The shift in Harry's demeanor was subtle, but Brandon caught it. His son paused mid-sentence, something about projected first-year revenue, and tilted his head slightly. "Dad, you okay? You seem kind of quiet." Harry nodded slowly. "I'm fine, just processing. This is a lot." Brandon smiled, relieved. "It is a lot, but it's exciting, right? This could be huge." Tiffany leaned forward, her expression earnest, practiced empathy. "We know it's a big ask, Harry. We're not taking this lightly. But we really believe in this concept, and having you involved would mean everything, not just financially, emotionally. This could be something we build together, something that represents our family." Harry almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, fingers finding the folded hospital bill, the paper soft from handling. He pulled it out slowly, set it on the table between the wine glasses and the architectural renderings, let it sit there unexplained for several seconds, while Brandon and Tiffany stared at it with growing confusion. "What's that?" Tiffany asked. Harry smoothed the paper flat, revealing the Chicago Memorial letterhead. "The itemized charges, the total amount due." "This," Harry said quietly, "is what a life costs. $47,312. That's what it cost to keep me alive 6 months ago when my heart tried to quit." Brandon's face went pale. "Dad, I don't... Why are you..." Harry continued, his voice steady, measured, each word deliberate. "I paid this bill by selling the truck your mother gave me, the truck I spent 2 years restoring, the last thing I had that connected me to her. Sold it for $35,000, took a $25,000 loss to get cash immediately because I needed emergency surgery and my insurance wouldn't cover everything. And you know why I sold it." Brandon was staring at the bill like it might bite him. Tiffany had leaned back slightly, her marketing smile fading. "Because when I called you from the hospital when I asked for help, you told me you couldn't access funds because everything was tied up in cryptocurrency. Do you remember that conversation?" Brandon's mouth opened and closed. It wasn't. The timing was really complicated. Dad, the market was at a critical point. Harry cut him off. "I'm not asking you to explain the market. I'm asking if you remember choosing your crypto position over your father's cardiac surgery." Brandon's face cycled through emotions. Defensive anger, guilty discomfort, confused justification. "That's not fair. You're making it sound like I chose money over you when really it was just about liquidity and timing and..." Harry's voice remained calm, but something in his eyes made Brandon stop talking. "You're right. It was about timing. The timing of needing $47,000 versus the timing of protecting your investment, and you made a choice. I'm not saying it was easy. I'm not saying it didn't make financial sense. I'm just saying you made a choice, and that choice told me exactly what I'm worth to you." Tiffany tried to intervene, her voice taking on that soothing tone she probably used in client meetings. "Harry, this isn't... We didn't understand how serious it was. If we'd known you were going to sell the truck, if you'd known I was desperate enough to sell my most valuable possession to save my own life, you might have reconsidered?" Harry asked. "Is that the threshold? I needed to prove I was dying before family obligations kicked in." Tiffany went quiet. Brandon was staring at the bill, his face red, jaw working like he was trying to formulate a response that wouldn't make this worse. Finally, he looked up, eyes meeting his father's. "We should have helped. I know that. I've known that for months. I didn't know how to bring it up, how to apologize." It got easier to just not talk about it. Harry nodded slowly. "I know. I noticed. 6 months of not talking about it. 6 months of minimal contact. And now you want $500,000 to open a restaurant. You want me to invest in your dream while I'm still paying off the debt from staying alive. Do you see the problem here? Do you see why this might feel complicated?" Brandon's voice was small. "I see it. I do, and I'm sorry. I should have said that immediately. I'm sorry, Dad." The apology hung in the air, sincere but insufficient. Too late and too prompted by confrontation rather than genuine remorse. Harry looked at his son, really looked at him, trying to find the kid who used to help on job sites, who'd learned the value of work and money and sacrifice. That kid was gone, replaced by this man who apologized when caught, but hadn't apologized when it mattered, who was sorry now because his investment pitch had backfired, not because he'd genuinely grasped the magnitude of what he'd done. Tiffany was calculating. Harry could see it in her eyes, trying to figure out if this could be salvaged or if the deal was dead. She reached out, touched Brandon's arm in a gesture that might have been comfort or might have been a signal to regroup. "Maybe we should table the restaurant discussion," she said carefully. "This clearly wasn't the right time. We didn't mean to be insensitive." Harry almost admired her tactical retreat. Almost. But he wasn't done. Wasn't letting them leave without understanding completely. "You want to know what really hurts?" Harry asked, his voice quieter now, almost conversational. "It's not the money. I've been broke before. I'll be broke again. It's not even the truck, though losing that was like losing Margaret a second time. What hurts is realizing that when it mattered most, when the choice was binary, save your father or save your investment, you saved the investment. And I don't think you even struggled with it. I think it was easy. I think you calculated the risk to reward, and I came up short." Brandon was crying now, silent tears running down his face, the first genuine emotion Harry had seen from him all night. I didn't think of it like that. I thought you'd be fine. The doctors said it was routine." Harry's laugh was bitter. "It's only routine if you survive. And I only survived because I sold everything that mattered. You thought I'd be fine because you needed me to be fine. Because if I wasn't fine, you'd have to live with choosing money over your father's life. So you convinced yourself the risk was minimal. The surgery was routine. I'd figure it out. And I did figure it out. But you were never planning to help me. You were always planning to protect your position." The table had gone silent. Other diners nearby were pretending not to listen, but Harry knew they were hearing every word. The performance of wealthy people enjoying expensive meals continued around them, but at their table, reality had intruded. Brutal, unvarnished, the kind of family conflict that usually happened behind closed doors, not in upscale steakhouses surrounded by Wagyu beef and imported wine. Tiffany was texting someone under the table, probably a friend, probably asking how to extract themselves from this disaster. Brandon was still crying, shoulders shaking, face in his hands. And Harry felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just emptiness. The confrontation he'd imagined for 6 months was happening, and it wasn't bringing any relief, just confirmation that he'd lost his son long before the heart attack. The heart attack had just revealed what was already true. "I can't invest in your restaurant," Harry said finally. "Not because I don't have the money, though I don't, but because even if I did, Even if I won $500,000 tomorrow, I couldn't give it to you. Not after this. Not when you've demonstrated that family is conditional, that love has terms and conditions, that I'm worth helping when it's convenient, but not when it costs you something. Brandon looked up, face wet, expression devastated. Dad, please, we can make this right. We can pay you back for the surgery. We can. Harry shook his head. It's not about paying me back. It's about what you chose, what you valued, and I don't think you can undo that. I don't think I can forget it. Every time I look at you now, I see the son who let his father sell his most precious possession to avoid dying alone. And I can't invest in the future of someone who wasn't willing to invest in my present. He stood up, leaving the bill on the table, leaving Brandon crying into his hands, leaving Tiffany frozen mid-text, leaving the expensive wine barely touched and the food they'd ordered but not eaten. He walked out of Gibson's Steakhouse into the Chicago night, into air that felt cleaner than the restaurant's climate-controlled atmosphere, into a life that no longer included his son in any meaningful way. The doorman asked if he needed a cab. Harry said no, he'd walk. And he did walk north along Rush Street, past the luxury boutiques and trendy bars, past the life his son had chosen over him, walking until his legs hurt and his chest ached, but not from cardiac issues. From grief. From the death of a relationship that had been mortally wounded 6 months ago and had finally, tonight, stopped breathing. The funeral would be private. The burial had already happened, and Harry was alone with his verdict, wondering if he'd been too harsh, knowing he hadn't been harsh enough, understanding that justice and family rarely occupied the same space, and he'd chosen justice because family had already chosen money. What Harry didn't know, what he wouldn't learn for another 2 weeks, was that the $500,000 Brandon and Tiffany needed wasn't just for a restaurant. It was to cover the losses they'd taken when their cryptocurrency investment collapsed, the very investment they'd protected instead of helping him. The market had turned, their position had crashed, they'd lost everything they'd put in, and then some, leveraged to the point of financial ruin. The restaurant was a desperate pivot, a way to recoup losses, to rebuild. They'd approached other investors. All had passed. Harry was the last option, and his refusal meant bankruptcy, meant losing the condo, meant destroying the life they'd built on digital assets that had evaporated like morning fog. But Harry didn't know that yet. Wouldn't know until Tiffany's mother called him, furious, blaming him for their financial collapse, accusing him of punishing his son for one mistake, and even when he learned the truth, even when he understood the stakes, Harry's answer would remain the same. No, because some betrayals you don't recover from. Some choices reveal character so completely that all future decisions are tainted. And the moment Brandon chose crypto over cardiac surgery was one of those choices. For now, though, Harry just walked. Walked through Chicago's expensive neighborhoods, past the life his son wanted and couldn't have, past the dreams that required fathers to sacrifice everything, including dignity and self-respect. Walked until he was tired enough to sleep without dreaming of hospital rooms and sold trucks and sons who became strangers. Walked until he believed his own verdict, not guilty, not innocent, just done. The trial was over, the jury had deliberated, and the only verdict that mattered was the one Harry could live with, alone, but alive, worth more than $47,000, worth more than cryptocurrency. Worth enough to walk away from family that treated him as an investment opportunity rather than a person deserving of basic human decency. The night was cold, but Harry didn't feel it. Didn't feel anything except the lightness of a burden released. He'd carried his son for 62 years. Tonight, he'd finally set him down. And if Brandon couldn't stand on his own, couldn't survive without Harry's money, couldn't build a life without exploiting his father, then maybe that was a lesson worth learning. Maybe sometimes the best thing a father could do was nothing. No rescue, no bailout, no more chances to prove that blood meant nothing when measured against profit margins and portfolio performance. The walking had taken Harry from River North to Lincoln Park, miles of pavement and crosswalks and streetlights illuminating his path like runway markers guiding him somewhere, anywhere that wasn't that restaurant. His phone had been buzzing in his pocket, ignored, almost certainly Brandon calling or texting, trying to explain or apologize or convince. Harry didn't care which. The time for explanations had passed. The time for apologies had been 6 months ago, immediately after the surgery, when genuine remorse might have meant something. Now it was just damage control, crisis management, the same skills Tiffany used in her marketing job applied to familial disaster. Harry turned down a side street, recognized where he was. 3 blocks from Brandon's condo. The building rose up ahead, glass and steel, modern luxury, the kind of place that had been built in the last decade to house the young wealthy, the tech workers and finance professionals and commercial real estate agents who were remaking Chicago's neighborhoods into playgrounds for affluent millennials. Harry had been there before, for dinners and holidays, always feeling out of place among the marble lobby and designer furnishings and neighbors who were universally younger, richer, better educated. The truck conversation had happened in that building. Tommy had delivered the cash to the doorman, an older guy named Marcus who'd called Brandon to come down and retrieve it. Brandon had texted Harry about it that same day, confused and slightly annoyed at the inconvenience. "Why'd you have the guy bring cash here? I had to stop working to come deal with it. Could have just had him deposit it somewhere." The text had arrived while Harry was still in the hospital, recovering from surgery, weak and exhausted and processing the reality that he'd sold his most valued possession while his son complained about the minor inconvenience of accepting $35,000 in cash. Harry hadn't responded to that text, or the follow-up, or any of Brandon's messages for a week. When he'd finally answered, it was short. "Sold the truck to pay for the surgery you wouldn't help with. Cash went to your place so you'd know what it cost." Brandon's response had been defensive, as expected. "You're acting like I didn't want to help when I literally couldn't access the funds. We've talked about this." Harry hadn't replied again. Silence seemed more powerful than words. Now, standing outside that building 6 months later, Harry wondered if Brandon even remembered that exchange. If the text thread still existed on his phone, or if he'd deleted it, erased the evidence, made it easier to pretend nothing had happened. Memory was selective. People remembered what they wanted to remember, constructed narratives that cast themselves favorably, edited out the inconvenient truths. Brandon probably remembered the restaurant pitch as going well until his father inexplicably became hostile. Would tell the story that way. We were presenting this amazing opportunity, and Dad just lost it. Started talking about the hospital and the truck and stuff that happened months ago. Totally blindsided us. The version where Harry was unreasonable, where the past should stay in the past, where family meant letting things go and moving forward. Never mind that moving forward required acknowledging what happened. Never mind that some things couldn't be let go because they fundamentally altered who people were to each other. Harry's phone stopped buzzing. Either Brandon had given up or run out of things to say. Either way, the silence was welcome. Harry stood outside the condo building for another few minutes, looking up at the illuminated windows, wondering which one was Brandon's, whether he was home yet or still at the restaurant, whether Tiffany was comforting him or strategizing their next move. Then he turned and walked the opposite direction toward the L station, toward public transportation that would take him back to Logan Square and his small apartment, and his life without his son. The walk had cleared his head, but not his heart. The confrontation had been necessary but not satisfying. He'd said what needed saying, but it hadn't changed anything, hadn't made Brandon understand in any meaningful way, had just created a rupture that probably couldn't be repaired. And Harry wasn't sure he wanted to repair it, wasn't sure there was anything left worth saving. The truth Harry was beginning to accept, the reality settling over him like snow accumulating on a Chicago winter night, was that his son was gone. Not dead, not missing, just gone in the way people disappear when they become unrecognizable, when the person you thought you knew turns out to be someone else entirely. The Brandon he'd raised, the kid who'd worked summers on construction sites and learned the value of honest labor, had been replaced by this adult who measured life in return on investment and saw family as a resource to exploit. Or maybe that Brandon had never really existed. Maybe Harry had projected his values onto his son, assumed that teaching by example was the same as successful teaching, never recognized that Brandon was learning different lessons from different teachers. Tiffany had taught him that image mattered more than substance. The commercial real estate world had taught him that relationships were networking opportunities. The cryptocurrency boom had taught him that traditional wealth building was for suckers, that real money came from speculation and risk and being early to emerging markets, and Harry had taught him. What exactly? That hard work built character? That family came first? That some things mattered more than profit? If those lessons had ever landed, they'd been overwritten, updated, made obsolete by newer, shinier teachings from people Brandon respected more than his father. This realization hurt worse than the heart attack. At least the heart attack had been biological, impersonal, the consequence of genetics and age and cholesterol that had nothing to do with anyone's choices or values. But losing Brandon was entirely personal, was the direct result of choices made, priorities established, values embraced. And Harry couldn't fix it with surgery or medication or lifestyle changes, couldn't stent open a blocked relationship, couldn't bypass the damage done. The injury was permanent, the loss was complete. And sitting in that acknowledgement, riding the L train north through Chicago neighborhoods, watching his reflection in the dark window glass, Harry understood that tonight had been a funeral. He'd buried his son, not literally, but emotionally, spiritually. The Brandon he'd loved was dead, had been dead for years probably, and the man who wore his son's face was a stranger Harry didn't particularly like and certainly didn't trust. And funerals required letting go, required accepting loss, required moving forward into a life without the person you'd lost. Harry had moved forward after Margaret died, had learned to live alone, to cook for one, to fill the silence with work and routine and small pleasures. He'd have to learn that again now. Learn to live without his son, without the hope of reconciliation, without the fantasy that someday Brandon would understand and apologize and they'd repair what was broken. The next 2 weeks were quiet in the way disaster zones are quiet after everyone stops screaming. Brandon tried calling twice. Harry didn't answer. Brandon sent texts. Long ones, apologetic ones, defensive ones. Harry read them but didn't respond. What was there to say? The words that mattered had already been spoken. The positions were clear. Any further conversation would just be negotiation, and Harry wasn't negotiating. He'd made his decision, rendered his verdict. Brandon was free to appeal, but Harry wasn't the court for that appeal. Someone else would have to absolve him. Grant him forgiveness. Give him the clean slate he was seeking. Harry's only remaining job was to protect his own peace, to avoid being pulled back into dysfunction masquerading as family. He changed his routine to minimize the chance of running into Brandon accidentally, stopped eating at restaurants they both knew, avoided the neighborhoods where Brandon worked, built a life that had Brandon-sized holes in it that would eventually, hopefully, hurt less. Then Tiffany's mother called Helen, a woman Harry had met 3 times at engagement parties and the wedding, and one awkward holiday dinner where the generational and class divides had been painfully obvious. Helen was old money, the kind that came with expectations and judgments and the absolute certainty that she was right about everything. Her voice on the phone was ice. "Harry, we need to talk about what you've done to Brandon and Tiffany." Harry had been replacing a light fixture when his phone rang, standing on a ladder in someone's kitchen, and something about Helen's tone made him climb down and sit before responding. "What I've done to them?" Helen continued like he hadn't spoken. "Your refusal to support their restaurant has destroyed their finances. They're facing bankruptcy, losing everything. And for what? Because you're still angry about a hospital bill from months ago. Because you're punishing your own son for making a difficult financial decision during a volatile market." Harry felt his grip tighten on the phone. "Is this really about the restaurant, or is there something you're not telling me?" Helen's pause confirmed his suspicion. The restaurant was a chance for them to recover from some unfortunate investment losses. That's all you need to know. "Tell me about the investment losses," Harry said. "The cryptocurrency, the reason Brandon couldn't help with my surgery." Helen's voice turned defensive. "That's not relevant. What's relevant is that they're your family and they need help, and you're refusing out of spite." Harry's laugh was bitter. The crypto crashed, didn't it? That investment they protected instead of helping me, it collapsed. And now they're broke. And the restaurant wasn't a dream. It was a desperation play to recoup losses. Helen went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was cold. "Yes," the market corrected. "They took significant losses, which is why the restaurant was so important. It was their way back. And you've destroyed that chance." Harry stood up, paced the kitchen he'd been working in. "Let me make sure I understand. Brandon chose to protect a cryptocurrency investment instead of helping with my cardiac surgery. That investment then lost all its value, and now you're calling to tell me I should give him $500,000 to recover from the losses he took, protecting the money he wouldn't give me to not die?" Helen's voice rose. "Don't be dramatic. You weren't going to die. It was a routine procedure." Harry's control snapped. "I sold my dead wife's last gift to me to pay for that routine procedure. I liquidated the most meaningful possession I owned because my son valued digital currency over his father's life. And that currency then evaporated, and somehow I'm the villain in your version of this story?" Helen's response was instant. "You're the adult. You're the parent. You should be supporting your child's success, not holding grudges over money. Family helps family. That's what family means." Harry thought about all the ways he'd helped Brandon over the years, the college tuition he'd paid, the car he'd helped finance, the down payment assistance for Brandon's first apartment, the tools he'd given him when Brandon briefly considered following Harry into construction, the free labor on various apartment repairs, the loans that became gifts when repayment never materialized, the decades of showing up, being present, prioritizing his son's needs over his own wants. And Brandon's version of family helping family was watching his father sell everything valuable to afford emergency surgery while protecting a crypto position. The math didn't balance, not even close. "You're right," Harry said quietly. "Family should help family. And when I needed help, when I was facing surgery that I couldn't afford, your daughter and my son chose to protect their investment instead. That was their choice. This is mine. And my choice is no, I won't be funding their restaurant or their recovery or their next venture. They're adults. They made adult decisions. They can live with adult consequences, Helen's voice turned venomous. You're a bitter old man punishing successful young people because you couldn't achieve what they have. This isn't about the hospital, it's about jealousy. Harry hung up, didn't say goodbye. Just ended the call and sat in someone else's kitchen, in a house he was working on, surrounded by tools and light fixtures and the honest labor that had defined his life, and felt nothing but relief. The call from Helen clarified things, removed any lingering doubt about whether Harry was being too harsh. The full picture was now visible. Brandon and Tiffany had gambled on cryptocurrency, had bet everything on a volatile market, had refused to help Harry because pulling money out would mean realizing losses. The gamble failed, the market crashed, they lost their investment. And rather than accepting responsibility, rather than acknowledging that their choice to prioritize crypto over cardiac surgery had been morally and financially disastrous, they'd developed a new scheme. The restaurant, a way to recoup losses, and they'd positioned it as a family legacy opportunity, framed Harry's potential investment as something he should feel honored to participate in, never acknowledged the betrayal that preceded the ask. And when Harry refused, when he produced the hospital bill and forced them to confront what they'd done, they'd painted him as the unreasonable one, the bitter father, the grudge holder, the man who couldn't let go of the past and support his child's future. The reframing was expert-level manipulation, the kind Tiffany probably learned in marketing school, where you control the narrative by controlling the terms of discussion. But Harry knew the truth. Knew that choosing investment over family had consequences. Knew that betrayal couldn't be erased with apologies or new opportunities or accusations of bitterness. Knew that some choices revealed character so completely that all future interactions were permanently altered. Brandon had shown him exactly who he'd become. And Helen's call had confirmed that the family Brandon married into saw Harry the same way Brandon now saw him. As a resource, a potential funding source, someone whose value was measured entirely in terms of what he could provide financially. There was no acknowledgement of Harry as a person, no consideration of his feelings or his perspective, or his legitimate grievance. Just anger that he wasn't performing his role. The role of supportive father who gave endlessly and asked nothing in return, who absorbed hurt and betrayal and responded with unconditional love and open checkbooks. Harry had played that role for decades. He was done playing it now. The bankruptcy, when it came, was public record. Harry didn't go looking for the information, but Chicago's a small city in some ways, and contractors talk, and word filtered back that Brandon Foster and his wife had filed Chapter 7, liquidating assets, trying to settle debts. The condo was gone, sold at a loss in a hurry. They'd moved to a smaller place in a cheaper neighborhood, downscaling the life they'd built on leverage and speculation. Brandon's commercial real estate career had stalled, the bankruptcy making it difficult to work in a field built on financial credibility. Tiffany had left her marketing firm, whether by choice or force, Harry never learned, and was working as a freelance consultant, hustling for clients, rebuilding from scratch. The fall from Lincoln Park to wherever they'd landed was steep and fast and probably terrifying. And Harry felt no satisfaction in their suffering, no vindication, just sadness that it had come to this. That the son he'd raised had made such catastrophically poor choices that his life was now wreckage. That the family he'd hoped to have, grandchildren, holidays, the normal rhythms of generational connection, would never exist because the bridge between him and Brandon had collapsed and couldn't be rebuilt. Friends asked if he'd reconsider, if bankruptcy didn't change things, if maybe now Brandon had learned his lesson and deserved another chance. Harry's answer was always the same. The bankruptcy wasn't the lesson, the hospital was. And Brandon hadn't learned from the hospital. Had doubled down, asked for more money, framed his father as unreasonable for refusing. The bankruptcy was just consequence catching up to choice, natural law asserting itself. And Harry wasn't going to interfere with that process, wasn't going to rescue Brandon from the outcome of his own decisions. That wouldn't be helping. That would be enabling, would be teaching Brandon that bad choices didn't really matter because Dad would always fix things, but Dad wasn't fixing things anymore. Dad was living his own life, smaller and quieter than before, but honest, built on values that didn't shift based on market conditions. Grounded in the reality that relationships required reciprocity, that family meant showing up, that love was measured in sacrifice, not strategy. 6 months after the dinner, a year after the heart attack, Harry's life had settled into new patterns. He worked, he came home, he read, he walked. He attended a support group for cardiac patients where people discussed their near-death experiences and recovery processes, and the strange gift of surviving something that should have killed you. Harry never mentioned his son in group, never talked about the betrayal, just focused on the physical recovery, the medications and exercise and dietary changes. But the group leader, a former nurse named Patricia who'd survived her own cardiac event, pulled him aside one day after a session. "You're carrying something," she said. "Something beyond the heart attack." Harry had tried to deflect, but Patricia was persistent. "Whatever it is, you need to talk about it. Carrying unresolved trauma will kill you as sure as cholesterol." So Harry told her about the phone call from the hospital, about selling the truck, about Brandon's choice, about the restaurant pitch and the hospital bill and Helen's accusatory call and the bankruptcy. Told her everything while sitting in a church basement on folding chairs, fluorescent lights humming overhead, surrounded by the mundane setting of support group meetings. Patricia had listened without interrupting. When Harry finished, she'd been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd asked, "Do you think he understands what he did?" Harry had shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not." Patricia nodded. "And if he does understand, if he came to you tomorrow with genuine remorse, real accountability, what would you do?" Harry had thought about it. Really thought. Tried to imagine Brandon showing up at his door, not with excuses or explanations, but with actual understanding of the harm caused and genuine desire to make amends. And honestly, even in that imagined scenario, Harry wasn't sure he could forgive. The wound was too deep. The betrayal too fundamental. Some things break in ways that can't be fixed, even with the best intentions and strongest adhesive. "I don't think I could let him back in," Harry admitted. "I think the trust is destroyed. And without trust, what is there?" Patricia had nodded again. "That's fair. That's your boundary. And maintaining that boundary isn't cruel, it's self-preservation. You're allowed to protect yourself from people who've hurt you, even if those people are family, especially if those people are family, because family can hurt you in ways strangers never could. The permission to maintain distance, to not forgive, to prioritize his own well-being over familial obligation was liberating. Harry had been raised in a generation and culture where family was sacred, where blood was supposed to mean unconditional loyalty, where you forgave and forgot and moved on because that's what good people did. But Patricia's reframing that protecting yourself from harm wasn't selfish but necessary gave Harry language for what he'd been feeling. He wasn't being cruel to Brandon. He was being kind to himself. And after 62 years of putting others first, of being the reliable one, the helper, the supporter, maybe it was time to prioritize his own peace. Maybe the best thing he could do for himself was exactly what he'd been doing. Maintaining boundaries, refusing reconciliation that wasn't genuine, building a life that didn't include people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, wasn't the family he'd hoped for, but it was honest. And honesty, Harry was learning,
mattered more than hope. So that's where things stood, a year after the heart attack that revealed everything. 6 months after the dinner that ended everything. Brandon was rebuilding his life from bankruptcy. Harry was rebuilding his life from betrayal. They existed in the same city but separate universes, connected by biology but divided by choice.
Sometimes Harry wondered if he'd been too harsh, if refusing to help with the restaurant had been justified or petty, if maintaining distance was healthy boundary setting or stubborn pride. But then he'd remember the phone call from the hospital, the sound of Brandon explaining why crypto mattered more than cardiac surgery, the casual dismissiveness of "you'll be fine, they can't refuse to treat you," and Harry would know that his decision was right. Not easy, not painless, but right. Because some betrayals you don't come back from. Some choices reveal truth so clearly that forgiveness becomes impossible, not because you're unforgiving, but because you finally see clearly. And what Harry saw clearly was that his son was someone he didn't know, someone he didn't particularly like, someone he certainly didn't trust. And being related to that person didn't obligate Harry to relationship, didn't require forgiveness or reconciliation or any interaction at all. Blood made you relatives. Love made you family. And the love, whatever form it had taken, was gone, replaced by clarity, by boundaries, by the peace that comes from accepting loss and moving forward without the weight of hope that things might change. You've heard everything now, every detail, every complication, every moment of the story, from the hospital to the steakhouse to the fallout. You know what Brandon chose, you know what it cost Harry, you know how it ended. Now it's your turn to decide. Who was in the wrong? Was anyone fully right, or is it more complicated than that? Before you cast your verdict, let's break down the psychology behind what we just witnessed. Because there are mechanisms at play here, invisible machinery grinding beneath the surface drama, patterns that explain how two people who loved each other ended up on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. You've heard the story. You feel the anger, maybe the confusion, maybe the sadness. But do you know exactly what happened to your brain just now while you were listening? Do you understand the psychological weapons that were deployed, often unconsciously, in that relationship? This isn't about learning for learning's sake. This is about exposing the machinery underneath the drama, about naming the thing that makes you feel crazy when you're in it. Because what happened to Harry wasn't unique, it's a pattern, a predictable sequence that plays out in relationships when certain toxic dynamics take root. And once you can name it, once you can see the mechanism, you can protect yourself from it. You can recognize it happening to you or people you love. You can call it what it is instead of wondering if you're being too sensitive or too harsh or too unforgiving. The primary weapon deployed against Harry was something psychologists call DARVO. It's an acronym: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. It's what happens when someone who's harmed you responds to confrontation not with accountability, but with a 3-step process designed to make you the bad guy. First, they deny. Deny the harm happened. Deny it was that serious. Deny their responsibility. Brandon did this when he minimized the surgery as routine, when he framed his choices about liquidity timing rather than values, when he suggested Harry was making it sound more dramatic than it was. The denial creates confusion because you know what happened, you experienced it. But now you're being told your experience wasn't real or wasn't as bad as you remember. Second, they attack, not physically but emotionally. They shift focus from their behavior to your behavior, make you defend yourself instead of them accounting for themselves. Helen did this masterfully when she called Harry bitter and jealous, when she accused him of grudge holding, when she suggested his refusal to fund the restaurant was about punishing success rather than protecting himself from people who'd already betrayed him. The attack puts you on defense, makes you justify your hurt rather than them justifying their harm, but the third step is the killer. Reverse victim and offender. Make the person who was harmed into the perpetrator. Make the person who caused harm into the victim. Brandon and Tiffany positioned themselves as victims of Harry's unreasonableness. They were the ones suffering bankruptcy. They were the ones facing financial ruin. They were the ones being denied family support. And Harry, the man who'd sold his most precious possession to survive emergency surgery his son refused to help with, became the villain. The bitter father, the unsupportive parent, the man standing in the way of their success. This reversal is crazy-making. It makes you question your own reality, makes you wonder if maybe you are being too harsh, too judgmental, too unwilling to forgive and move forward. And that's exactly what it's designed to do. It's designed to manipulate you into accepting harm, into abandoning your boundaries, into questioning your own legitimate grievances until you give in and give them what they want, which in this case was $500,000 and absolution for choosing crypto over cardiac surgery. Remember when Brandon said, "I told you we were leveraged at the dinner"? That wasn't an explanation. That was step one of Darvo. Deny that the choice was about values by framing it as about liquidity. And when Harry didn't accept that reframing, when he produced the hospital bill as evidence, watch what happened. Tiffany immediately tried to minimize. We didn't understand how serious it was. More denial. If we'd known you were going to sell the truck. Subtle attack, implying Harry's decision to sell was the problem rather than their refusal to help being the problem. And throughout that conversation, the underlying message was clear. You're making too big a deal of this. You're being unreasonable. You're punishing us for a mistake. Victim and offender reversed. The Darvo sequence executed perfectly, probably unconsciously, because this is how people who lack genuine accountability operate. They don't sit with their guilt, they transform it, transfer it, make it someone else's problem, preferably the person they harmed. Most people missed the early deployment of Darvo in this story. Go back to the beginning, to the engagement party, to Tiffany's mother saying, "You're investing in his potential." That wasn't a neutral observation, that was framing, setting up the narrative that Brandon was a project, an investment, something that required capital and development. It positioned Harry not as a father but as a potential investor in Brandon's success. And investments have terms, have expected returns, have clauses about withdrawal and loss. You don't invest emotionally in an investment, you calculate rationally. And that framework, introduced early and reinforced consistently, was preparation for the eventual ask. Because once you've accepted that your child is an investment opportunity rather than a person deserving unconditional love, it becomes easier to make investment decisions. Pull capital during downturns, refuse bailouts for poor performance, demand returns before additional investment. The language of finance replaced the language of family, and with it, the obligations of family were converted into the calculations of portfolio management. And Harry, by accepting that framing initially, by not challenging the fundamental redefinition of the parent-child relationship as investor investment, had made himself vulnerable to exactly what happened. The impact of Darvo when combined with financial manipulation is devastating. It creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The mental discomfort of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Harry believed he'd been deeply wronged, but he also believed that good fathers support their children unconditionally. Those beliefs couldn't coexist comfortably. One had to give. Either he was wrong about being wronged, maybe the surgery wasn't that serious, maybe he was overreacting, maybe Brandon's choice was reasonable, or he was wrong about unconditional support being a parental obligation. The dissonance creates internal pressure. Your brain wants resolution, wants consistency. And Darvo exploits that by offering easy resolution. Just accept that you're being unreasonable. Just agree that family means helping regardless of past harm. Just let it go and move forward. The relief from dissonance would be immediate. The cost would be your reality, your boundaries, your self-respect. But the relief would feel good in the moment. And many people take that deal. Choose temporary relief over long-term integrity. Harry didn't. But the cost of maintaining his position, of sitting in the dissonance, was enormous. The biological reality of what Harry experienced isn't metaphorical, it's physiological. When you're betrayed by someone you love, your brain processes it as physical pain. The same neural pathways light up, the same stress hormones flood your system, cortisol, adrenaline. Your body goes into threat response mode, fight or flight. But you can't fight your own son, can't flee from family, so the stress has nowhere to go. It accumulates, becomes chronic, and chronic stress kills, literally. It damages your cardiovascular system, weakens your immune function, disrupts your sleep, impairs your cognition. Harry's heart attack probably had multiple causes: genetics, age, lifestyle, but the stress of Brandon's transformation from loving son to financial strategist certainly contributed. And then the betrayal at the hospital added acute stress on top of chronic stress, multiplied the damage, made recovery harder. Not just physical recovery, emotional recovery. Because how do you recover from the realization that the person you'd die for wouldn't spend money to keep you alive? Take the most frustrating decision Harry made, the one where you probably wanted to yell at him through your speakers. The moment he agreed to the dinner. 6 months after the hospital. 6 months of minimal contact and no resolution. And Brandon calls, suggests an expensive steakhouse, says he has something exciting to share. And Harry says yes. Why? Why walk into that trap? Why give Brandon another opportunity to hurt him? Because trauma bonding is real. Because the intermittent reinforcement of occasional positive interactions, a friendly phone call, a birthday text, the memory of who Brandon used to be, creates a pattern of hope. Slot machine psychology. Most pulls give you nothing, but occasionally you win. And those occasional wins keep you playing, keep you hoping that the next interaction will be different, that this time Brandon will show up as the son Harry remembers rather than the stranger he's become. Harry's brain, despite all evidence, still held the hope that the dinner might be an apology, might be reconciliation, might be Brandon acknowledging the harm and seeking to make amends. That hope, irrational but powerful, drove the decision to attend. And when the dinner turned out to be another ask, another calculation, another deployment of Darvo, the disappointment was crushing. But by then Harry was trapped in the situation, committed to seeing it through, forced to respond in real time to a pitch he hadn't expected, but probably should have anticipated. When you combine Darvo with trauma bonding, you don't get a relationship. You get a hostage situation. The person being harmed can't leave because they're chemically bonded through intermittent reinforcement. The person causing harm can't change because Darvo protects them from accountability, and everyone around them either takes sides or tells them to work it out because family. The system is self-perpetuating, stable in its dysfunction, and it only breaks when someone, usually the person being harmed, finally hits a limit, finally recognizes the pattern, finally chooses reality over hope. For Harry, that moment was the hospital bill on the table, the physical evidence that broke through the Darvo, the minimization, the reversal, forced Brandon and Tiffany to confront what they'd done. And when they still couldn't accept accountability, still couldn't sit with genuine remorse, still tried to minimize and reframe and make Harry the problem, that's when he knew. knew with certainty that couldn't be argued away or rationalized. The relationship was over, had been over. He'd just been refusing to accept it. Now you need to understand the evidence, the red flags that were there from the beginning, visible if you knew what to look for. These aren't just interesting observations, they're warning signs, predictive indicators, the kind of thing that if you see it in your own life or the life of someone you care about, should make you pause, should make you pay attention, should make you ask questions and set boundaries before the situation escalates to hospital bills and sold trucks and family estrangement, because patterns like this don't appear suddenly. They build gradually. Each flag is small individually, easy to dismiss, could be nothing, but together they form a pattern. And the pattern tells you everything you need to know about where this is headed. Most people only recognize red flags in the rearview mirror. Let's change that. Let's look at the 5 critical flags in Harry's story, the warning signs that predicted almost mathematically where this would end. Flag number 1 was the subtle beginning, the thing that looked romantic or normal or even positive at first, but actually wasn't. Go back to the engagement party, to Brandon navigating the room like a politician, to Tiffany and her mother discussing investing in his potential. That moment looked like success. Looked like Brandon was being ambitious, building a network, getting support from his fiancée's family. But look closer. Look at the language. Investment. Potential. Development. Those are business terms, and what they revealed was that Brandon's relationship with Tiffany was fundamentally transactional. She was investing in him, expecting returns, shaping him into something that met her standards and her family's standards. And Brandon was accepting that framing, was allowing himself to be treated as a project requiring capital injection and strategic guidance. That's not love, that's venture capital. Love accepts you as you are. Investment demands you become something else, something more valuable, something worthy of the capital expended. And once that framework was established, everything else followed logically. If Brandon was an investment, then his father was also an investment, or a potential source of investment capital. Either way, not a person, not family, just a resource to be leveraged. The test for distinguishing healthy ambition from toxic transactionalism is simple. Does the person value you for who you are or what you can become? Do they accept your current state or constantly push for optimization? Do they love you or your potential? Tiffany loved Brandon's potential, loved the man he could become with proper investment and guidance, the man who wore nice suits and drank expensive wine and could discuss terroir and worked in commercial real estate instead of construction. She loved the ROI, not the person, and you can see this in how she talked about the restaurant. It wasn't about passion for food or hospitality or creating something beautiful. It was about brand positioning and market differentiation and projected returns. Everything was calculation. Nothing was love. And Brandon, by accepting that framework, by not challenging it, by allowing his relationship to be redefined as a business partnership, sealed his own fate and his father's. Because once you accept that relationships are transactions, you make every decision transactionally, including the decision about whether to help your father with cardiac surgery or protect your cryptocurrency position. If you see this pattern, if someone in your life starts talking about you or treating you as an investment, as potential to be realized rather than a person to be loved, pause. Ask yourself what happens when the investment stops performing. Ask yourself whether this person would stand by you if you failed, if you stopped optimizing, if you became a loss instead of a gain. Ask yourself if you're loved for who you are or valued for what you might become. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, if you realize you're being loved conditionally, transactionally, with terms and performance expectations, then you need to address it, need to set a boundary, need to say, I'm not an investment, I'm a person, And if you can't love me as I am right now, then this isn't the relationship I want. That conversation is hard, but it's necessary. Because the alternative is what happened to Harry. Years of slow transformation from father to resource. Years of being valued for what he could provide rather than who he was. Years that culminated in a hospital room where his actual life was worth less than digital currency. Flag number 2 was the boundary violation, the moment when someone's no was ignored or negotiated away. For Harry, this happened multiple times, but the clearest instance was the free labor expectation. Remember how he offered to fix the shower valve and Tiffany refused because she wanted a licensed plumber for documentation? That sounds reasonable on the surface. But look at what it actually communicated. Harry's expertise, decades of professional construction experience, wasn't valuable unless it came with paperwork and liability insurance. His offer to help, motivated by love and desire to save them money, was rejected because it didn't meet their standards. His time and skill weren't worth anything. The boundary violation wasn't dramatic, wasn't aggressive, was actually dressed up as reasonable practical thinking, but it established a pattern. Harry's contributions needed to fit their framework, or they weren't wanted. He could help on their terms or not at all. And when he accepted that, when he didn't push back and say, actually my expertise is valuable regardless of paperwork, he taught them that his boundaries were negotiable, that they could set the terms of his participation in their lives, and they did, increasingly. This flag gets missed constantly because it's subtle. Because boundary violations often come dressed as reasonable requests or practical concerns. But here's how to test it. If someone asks you for help, proposes specific terms for that help, and those terms disregard your expertise, your time, your preferences, or your comfort, that's a boundary violation. They're not really asking for help. They're demanding you help in exactly the way they want, when they want, how they want, or not at all. Your autonomy doesn't matter. Your judgment doesn't count. You're a service provider, not a person with your own agency. And once you accept that role, once you agree to help only under their dictated terms, you've taught them that your boundaries are negotiable, that your no can become yes if they frame things correctly, that you exist to serve their needs rather than being a full participant in a mutual relationship. And from there, it's a short trip to much bigger violations, like asking for $500,000 while refusing to acknowledge you wouldn't help with $47,000. Because if someone's learned your boundaries don't matter, they'll keep pushing, keep asking, keep expecting, until you either collapse under the weight of their expectations or finally set a boundary that holds. The counter move when someone does this is immediate and clear. You name it. You say, I offered to help as a gift, out of love, for free. You're telling me that help isn't valuable unless it meets your administrative requirements. That feels like you're valuing paperwork over relationship. Is that really what you mean? Most people, when confronted directly, will backtrack, will say, no, of course not, we appreciate the offer. And then you get to set the terms. I'm happy to fix the valve, but I'm doing it as your family member, not your contractor. No documentation, no liability insurance, just me helping you because I can and I want to. Take it or leave it, that's a bounder hold. It says I'm offering this gift freely but on my terms, and if my terms aren't acceptable, that's fine, but don't reframe my gift as insufficient. Don't negotiate my generosity into something that serves only you. Harry didn't do that. And the pattern continued, escalated, until the ultimate boundary violation. We need you to fund our restaurant, but we won't acknowledge we refuse to fund your surgery. We need you to accept our terms. Your terms, like expecting basic family loyalty during medical crisis, don't matter. Flag number 3 is reality distortion. The moment when someone lies, gaslights, or rewrites history to avoid accountability. In Harry's story, this showed up in Brandon's text about the cash delivery. Why'd you send it to our place? Could have just had him deposit it. Like the cash was an inconvenience. Like Harry had other options, but chose the most disruptive one out of thoughtlessness. That text rewrote reality completely. The reality was Harry had just sold his most precious possession in desperate circumstances to pay for surgery his son refused to help with. The reality was the cash represented profound loss and betrayal. The reality was Harry sent it to Brandon's address specifically so Brandon would see it, hold it, feel the weight of what his choice had cost. But Brandon's text erased all that context, replaced it with a narrative where Harry was mildly annoying, the cash delivery was a logistical problem, and Brandon was put out by having to deal with it. That's gaslighting, making someone question their reality by presenting an alternative reality that serves the gaslighter's narrative. The crazy factor with this flag is how it makes you doubt yourself. When someone rewrites history confidently enough, when they present their version of events with absolute certainty, your brain starts questioning. Did I misunderstand? Am I remembering it wrong? Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe my interpretation was unfair, and that's the point. Gaslighting works by making you doubt your own perception, your own memory, your own reality. It's designed to make you crazy. To make you accept the gaslighter's version of events, because maintaining your own version requires too much energy, creates too much conflict, feels too isolating when everyone else seems to accept the alternative narrative. Harry felt this, felt the pull to just accept Brandon's framing, to agree that the cash delivery was an inconvenience he should have handled differently, to let the larger context fade away in favor of the simpler, less painful story. But he didn't. He held on to his reality, named what had happened, refused to let it be rewritten, and that resistance to gaslighting was ultimately what enabled him to maintain his boundary at the restaurant, because he knew what was real, knew what had happened, couldn't be talked into a different version. The countermove for reality distortion is documentation and verification. When someone starts rewriting history, you go back to the facts, to the texts, to the emails, to the timeline. You say, no, here's what actually happened, here's the evidence, here's the sequence of events, here's what you said at the time. You don't let them revise. You hold them to their words, their actions, their choices. And if they continue to insist on their alternative version despite evidence, you know you're dealing with someone who either genuinely can't perceive reality accurately or is deliberately manipulating you. Either way, not someone you can trust. Not someone you can have honest relationship with, because relationship requires shared reality, requires agreement on basic facts, requires accountability for actual actions. And if someone won't accept reality, won't acknowledge what they did, won't sit with the truth of their choices, then they can't change, can't grow, can't be trusted not to harm you again, because in their version, they didn't harm you the first time. In their version, you're overreacting, being dramatic, making problems where none exist. Flag number 4 is isolation/control. The systematic narrowing of someone's world, the yes against them rhetoric that seems protective but is actually a trap. For Harry, this manifested in how Brandon's life increasingly excluded him. The Sunday dinners stopped. The calls became less frequent. The visits were always on Brandon's schedule, in Brandon's space, under Brandon's terms. Harry wasn't invited into Brandon's new world, wasn't introduced to the important people, wasn't included in the significant moments. He was kept peripheral, marginal. Someone you call on holidays and see at obligatory family events, but not someone integrated into your actual life. This looked like growing up. Looked like an adult son building his own independent life. but it was actually isolation. Brandon was separating Harry from his daily reality, his decision-making, his support system of peers who might have noticed the toxic dynamics forming, and simultaneously Brandon was being isolated by Tiffany, pulled into her family, her values, her worldview. The US against them became Brandon and Tiffany against the world, including Harry, including anyone who might question their choices or challenge their framework. Isolation is the best predictor of future escalation because it removes external accountability. If you've successfully isolated someone from their support system, from people who might call out your behavior, from perspectives that challenge your narrative, then you can do whatever you want. The isolated person has no one to reality check with, no one to say, actually, that's not normal. Actually, you deserve better. Actually, what they're doing is wrong. They're alone with your version of reality. And your version becomes the only version. Brandon isolated Harry emotionally while simultaneously being isolated by Tiffany financially and socially. The crypto investment was isolated from scrutiny. Don't tell your dad about this, he won't understand. It's complicated, we know what we're doing. The restaurant pitch was isolated from accountability. We're presenting this to your father, but we're framing it our way, controlling the narrative, not letting him ask the hard questions until we've established the terms. Isolation meant control. Control meant power. Power meant they could ask for $500,000 without acknowledging they wouldn't give $47,000 because there was no one in Brandon's life close enough to say, wait, do you see the problem here? The counter move when someone is isolating you is to deliberately maintain connections, to refuse to let your world shrink to just them, to keep your friends, your hobbies, your independent activities, your support system, to not accept the US against them framing, to say I love you and I also love other people. And those things aren't in conflict unless you make them in conflict. And if someone tries to make them in conflict, if they say you're choosing your friends over me, or you're letting outside people interfere in our relationship, or you're not fully committed if you won't cut ties with people who question us, that's a massive red flag. That's isolation in progress, and you need to resist it hard, because once you're isolated, once they've successfully narrowed your world to just them, you've lost your ability to see clearly, to maintain perspective, to recognize when you're being harmed. You're alone in their reality, and their reality can be whatever they want it to be. Flag number 5 is the deadly escalation, the point of no return. The moment where something shifts from problematic to irredeemable. For Harry, this was the hospital call. Everything before that moment was concerning. The transactional relationship, the boundary violations, the gaslighting, the isolation, all of it was bad, damaging, worth addressing, but potentially recoverable. Brandon could have woken up, could have recognized what he was becoming, could have changed course. The hospital call ended that possibility because when you tell your father you won't help with emergency cardiac surgery because you're protecting a cryptocurrency investment, you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You've revealed something about yourself, your values, your priorities, your capacity for love. That can't be unrevealed. You've made a choice so definitive that it recontextualizes every previous choice and predicts every future choice. And the person you made that choice about will never forget it, will never be able to trust you again, will always know that when it mattered most, you failed them completely. Every escalating toxic relationship has a moment like this, a choice so bad it ends the plausible deniability. The moment where you can no longer tell yourself it's not that bad, or they didn't mean it, or it was just a one-time thing. The moment where the truth becomes undeniable. And interestingly, the toxic person often doesn't recognize this moment as significant. Brandon thought Harry would be fine, thought the surgery was routine, thought the financial calculation was reasonable, didn't understand he was making a relationship-ending choice because in his reality, distorted by Darvo and transactionalism, and Tiffany's influence, it was just a practical decision during a complicated market situation. But for Harry, it was definitional. It was the moment that answered every question about who his son really was. It was the moment of clarity that couldn't be undone by apologies or explanations or time. And 6 months later, when Brandon asked for $500,000, he still didn't understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Still thought the hospital thing was in the past. Still thought family meant Harry would help regardless. Still hadn't grasped that he'd destroyed the relationship and no amount of normalizing or minimizing would repair it. This is the final warning sign. When someone does something irredeemable and doesn't recognize it as irredeemable, when they minimize it or justify it or expect you to move past it, you're dealing with someone who lacks the moral framework to understand harm, who can't sit with accountability, who will hurt you again because they don't actually understand they hurt you the first time. And your only protection is distance, boundaries, refusal to engage because you can't teach someone to value you. You can't force someone to develop empathy. You can't make someone understand why choosing crypto over cardiac surgery was wrong if they fundamentally don't see it as wrong. All you can do is protect yourself. Remove yourself from harm's way. Accept that this person, no matter how much you love them, no matter what history you share, is not capable of the relationship you deserve, and move forward into a life that doesn't include them.
It's grief, it's loss, but it's also survival. And survival isn't selfish, it's necessary. So now the question isn't whether Brandon was wrong. The flags make that clear. The question is what Harry owed Brandon despite the wrongness. What does family obligation look like in the face of profound betrayal? Do you owe forgiveness to people who hurt you?
Do you owe support to people who wouldn't support you? Do you owe relationship to people related by blood, but not by values? These aren't easy questions. They don't have clean answers. And different people will answer differently based on their own values, their own experiences, their own tolerance for harm. But what's clear from Harry's story is that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional tolerance of abuse. That family is supposed to be a source of support, not a system of exploitation. That being someone's father doesn't make you their ATM or their emotional punching bag or their perpetual second chance. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone experience the consequences of their choices. Let them fall. Let them fail. Let them learn the hard way what they wouldn't learn when you were cushioning them from reality. You have the facts. You have the motive. You have the evidence. The story of Harry and Brandon, the psychology of Darvo and trauma bonding, the red flags that predicted the outcome. Now you must decide. Was Harry right to refuse the restaurant investment? Was he justified in cutting off his son, or was he too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to sacrifice relationship over money? Was Brandon's choice at the hospital understandable given market pressures, or was it an unforgivable betrayal? Was Tiffany a manipulator who corrupted Brandon's values, or was she just someone with different priorities who Brandon chose to align with? Is this a tragedy where both parties are victims of circumstance, or is there a clear villain? These are the questions you need to wrestle with, and there's no objectively correct answer, just your answer based on your values, your experiences, your understanding of what family means and what people owe each other. I'm handing you the gavel. The complete case file is in front of you. The witness has testified, the evidence has been presented, the psychological analysis has been provided. Now the deliberation is yours. Think about it. Really think. Don't just react emotionally. Consider all angles. Think about what you would have done in Harry's position. Think about what you would have done in Brandon's position. Think about where your lines are, what you would consider forgivable and what you would consider irredeemable. Think about your own relationships, your own family dynamics, your own boundaries, and then decide not just about Harry and Brandon, but about how you want to navigate similar situations in your own life. Because these situations happen, these choices arise, and having thought through them in advance, having established your own framework for what you'll accept and what you won't, for what you owe people and what they owe you, makes you stronger when the crisis arrives. The jury is you. The verdict is yours. And unlike in legal courts, there's no wrong answer. Just your truth, your judgment, your understanding of what's right and wrong in this impossibly messy situation. So take your time, think it through, and when you're ready, I'll see you in the comments with your verdict. Court is adjourned.